The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, a condensed version for people who don't have the patience to read. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you should know is that I was getting kicked out of another crummy school, Pensy Prep. I'd been failing just about everything except English, but that's not what made me want to leave. The whole place was full of phonies, the kind of guys who talk about you behind your back like Stradlater and his stupid grooming routine. He was my roommate, by the way, and a real pain in the ass. He's the kind of guy who's good looking, but all he does is use people, you know? He goes out with girls like Jane Gallagher, a kid I used to know back in the day. We played checkers a lot. She kept her kings in the back row because she liked the way they looked there. Anyway, I got real sore when I found out Stradlater was going out with her. One night, before I decided to leave Pensy for good, I had to write this composition for Stradlater. He was too busy being a big shot with Jane. I wrote about my brother Allie's baseball glove, the one he used to write poems on so he could read them in the outfield. Allie was my brother, but he died of leukemia when he was a kid. He was the best person I ever knew, and it still kills me to think about him. That's when I started to get mad at Stradlater. He didn't give a damn about Jane or my brother, just himself. We got into this big fight, and I ended up leaving Pensy that night a few days earlier than I was supposed to. I didn't want to go home yet though. My parents didn't know I was getting kicked out again, and I didn't want to face them. So I decided to head into New York City for a while. I took a train late at night and ended up at some lousy hotel. The whole city can be pretty crummy if you think about it. I tried calling up a few people, but nobody was around. I even thought about calling Jane, but I didn't. Instead, I went out to some clubs and bars, tried to have a good time, but the people I met were all phonies. These girls I danced with at one club kept talking about movie stars and how they thought they saw someone famous, but they couldn't care less about me. It just made me feel more alone. The next day, I called up Sally Hayes, this girl I used to date. She's kind of a pain, but she's nice looking, and I figured, what the hell, I didn't have anything better to do. We made plans to go see a show and ice skate later. Before meeting her though, I spent the morning wandering around the city. I thought about going to see my sister Phoebe, but it was too early. Phoebe's the only person in the whole world who isn't phony. She's smart as hell for her age, and she listens to me. I'm always worried about what will happen to her. I kept thinking about how kids grow up and become phonies, and I didn't want that to happen to Phoebe. When I met Sally, she looked great, but I couldn't stand her phony attitude. We went to see this show, which was alright, but the actors were so fake, and everyone clapped like it was the best thing they'd ever seen. I felt sick about it. Afterward, we went ice skating, and that's when I had this crazy idea. I told Sally we should just run away together, leave everything behind and live in the woods or something. She thought I was nuts, and maybe I was. We got into a fight, and she started crying. I don't know why I said all that stuff. I was just feeling trapped, you know? I finally decided to go see Phoebe. I snuck into my parents' apartment while they were out, and she was sleeping in her room. When I woke her up, she was so happy to see me, but she figured out right away that I'd been kicked out again. She's too smart for her own good. I tried to explain to her that I didn't care about school, that it's full of phonies, but she didn't get it. She kept asking me what I wanted to do with my life, and I didn't have an answer. The only thing I could think of was this image of myself standing in a field of rye, catching little kids before they fell off a cliff. That's the only thing I wanted, to save them from falling, from growing up, from becoming phonies like everyone else. Phoebe said I had it all wrong, but she didn't understand. I couldn't stay there long though. I didn't want my parents to find me, so I left. I went to Mr. Antolini's place, one of my old teachers. He was the only guy who ever told me something that made sense, that life is a game you have to play by the rules. But when I stayed at his place that night, something weird happened. I woke up to him patting my head and it freaked me out. Maybe he was just being nice, but I couldn't handle it, so I left. I started wandering around the city again, thinking about what Mr. Antolini had said, but mostly I was feeling lost, like everything was spinning out of control. By the next day, I was sick as hell, both in my head and in my body. I thought about leaving the city for good, heading out west and living a quiet life in some cabin where nobody would bother me, and I wouldn't have to deal with phonies anymore. But I couldn't leave without saying goodbye to Phoebe. When I went to her school, I found her note saying she wanted to run away with me. She showed up at the museum with this huge suitcase ready to go. It broke my heart. I couldn't drag her into all my crap, so I told her she had to stay. She got real mad at me, wouldn't even talk to me, but I knew it was the right thing to do. We went to the park after that, and I took her to the carousel. She rode around on those horses, reaching for the gold ring, and I just sat there watching her. I don't know what happened to me right then, but for the first time in a long time I felt okay. I wasn't mad or sad or anything, I just watched her, and it made me happy, I think maybe I realized that you can't stop kids from growing up, and maybe that's alright, maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Anyway, that's pretty much the whole story. I'm not going to tell you what happened after that, about how I ended up in this place talking to this psychoanalyst guy. I'm not even sure I'll go back to school or do anything normal. But sometimes I think about going home and maybe trying again. I miss people like Allie and I miss Phoebe. And that's what kills me, when I start missing everybody. If you enjoyed this, hit the subscribe button to be a part of Quick Reads for People with No Patience, and see the description below to find out how you can get the original classic. Who knows, we might have piqued your interest.